Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your provided materials and really dig into them to find the most crucial insights.
That's the idea.
So today, we're plunging into a book that, well, it definitely made some waves back in 1995. It's Jeremy Rifkin's The End of Work. The full title gives you a sense: The Decline of the Global Labor Force and the Dawn of the Postmarket Era.
Yeah, and it landed at such a fascinating moment, didn't it? Like you said, 1995, there was all this anxiety swirling around globalization. You had companies downsizing, re-engineering. Those words were suddenly everywhere.
Those buzzwords.
And there was this growing feeling that information technology, computers and the internet starting up, was going to change everything about work. People were, frankly, a bit spooked. Remember the jobless recovery talk in the early 90s? That really fed into it.
Absolutely. So Rifkin kind of captured that zeitgeist.
He really did. He wasn't the first person to worry about automation, obviously, but he connected it directly to the computer revolution in a very dramatic way.
Okay, so the big question for us today, looking back, 30 years later, is basically, was he right? Did we actually see the end of work he predicted because of technology taking over?
It feels incredibly relevant now, doesn't it? With all the talk about AI and robots doing jobs.
Exactly. It's like the same fundamental question, just with newer tech.
Yeah. So for this deep dive, we've got some excerpts from an analysis that looks back at Rifkin's book after 3 decades. Our mission really is to understand what he was arguing back then.
Get inside his predictions.
Right. And then compare that to what actually happened with the U.S. economy since 95. We'll look at, employment, unemployment stats, productivity, wages, all that stuff.
And the nonprofit sector, too. I remember that being part of his solution.
Yes, absolutely. He saw that as really key. So we'll check in on that as well. Basically, where did he hit the nail on the head and where did reality, go a different way?
All right, let's get into it. What was Rifkin's main argument? What did he mean by the end of work?
His core idea was pretty stark, really. He argued this high technology revolution, computers, robotics, telecommunications getting way more sophisticated, was causing a steady, and he got inevitable, decline in jobs worldwide.
Not just a temporary dip, but a fundamental shift.
Exactly. He called it the third industrial revolution.
Yeah.
First steam, then electricity and mass production, and now this, the information age revolution.
And it wasn't just about automating factory jobs, right?
Yeah.
That was maybe the key difference.
That's crucial. Rifkin really stressed that this new wave was different. It wasn't just machines doing physical work. It was technology performing cognitive tasks, conceptual work, management functions, administrative stuff.
Thinking machines, I think he called them.
Yes, thinking machines. Machines that could replace humans in jobs that, we always thought required a brain. That was the scary part for many people.
Wow. Okay, so pretty broad impact. Which sectors did he think were most vulnerable?
His view was basically everywhere. He saw the usual suspects like manufacturing and agriculture continuing to lose jobs. No surprise there, maybe.
Yeah, that was already happening.
But he also predicted huge job losses across the service sector. Retail, finance, administration, information services, the whole lot. He talked about millions of jobs facing virtual extinction.
Virtual extinction, that's strong language.
It is. And he thought any new jobs created would probably be low-paying temporary gigs. So not really a replacement. No sector was safe, his view.
And beyond just the job numbers, he saw this shaking up society itself, our whole relationship with work.
Absolutely. His point was that work is so central to, who we are, our identity, how society functions.
Yeah.
If that disappears or shrinks dramatically, it forces us to rethink everything. It wasn't just an economic forecast. It was a social and maybe psychological one, too.
Okay, that's the big picture. Let's dig into the details of his argument. This third industrial revolution idea. What made it so different in his eyes?
Well, like we touched on, the first 2 revolutions mostly automated muscle power, but this third one, driven by IT and computers, was about automating brain power.
The thinking machines again.
Right. He saw software, early AI, automation getting sophisticated enough to handle complex tasks, analysis, decision-making, stuff previously only humans did. He felt it was a huge leap.
And there's an underlying assumption there, isn't there, about technology driving everything?
Yeah, scholars call it technological determinism. It's the idea that technology itself is this powerful, almost unstoppable force that dictates how the labor market changes, maybe downplaying other factors like, economic policy or corporate strategy or how markets adapt. Rifkin definitely leaned into that view.
Okay. So how did this theory play out in specific sectors? Agriculture first, no more farmers. Pretty blunt title.
Very blunt. He predicted agricultural employment would just keep falling off a cliff. He used the example of the mechanical cotton picker.
Ah, yeah, that's a classic example.
Right. A single machine that basically wiped out the need for hundreds of thousands of manual laborers, mostly African-American sharecroppers, forcing this massive migration to cities. Rifkin saw future farm tech, automated harvesters, precision agriculture, even indoor farming doing the same thing all over again. He linked it directly to rising poverty in rural areas, technology just making farmers redundant.
Grim stuff. And manufacturing, the heartland of, traditional jobs.
Just as grim, according to Rifkin. He talked about the factory without employees,
Yep.
robots, automation, combined with management fads like lean production.
Which is all about efficiency, cutting waste, often cutting people.
Exactly. He pointed to examples like U.S. Steel cutting its workforce massively but keeping production up with new mini-mills, or GE slashing jobs while sales went through the roof.
So doing more with way fewer people.
Precisely. His prediction was that traditional blue-collar factory jobs would be, virtually non-existent by the mid-21st century. He even thought union leaders were kind of naive, underestimating how much tech would replace even skilled workers.
So farms emptying out, factories emptying out. But wasn't the common thinking back then that, okay, service jobs will save us? That sector will just grow and grow.
The standard view, yeah.
Yeah.
But Rifkin pushed back hard against that. He said, nope, the service sector isn't the magic bullet.
Why not?
He argued the same tech revolution was coming for service jobs, too. Think about it. Automated checkouts in supermarkets, ATMs replacing bank tellers.
Online banking taking off.
Right. Automated phone systems, digital libraries replacing librarians, word processing, and email decimating armies of typists and clerks. He called it the rise of the silicon-collar workforce and the virtual office. White-collar jobs were just as vulnerable as blue-collar ones in his view.
Okay, so no escape hatch in the service economy either. This sounds like a recipe for massive societal division. He talked about polarization, right?
Yes, that was a really central and frankly worrying part of his forecast. He predicted society would split dramatically.
Into who?
On one side, you'd have this small information elite. Managers, scientists, engineers, knowledge workers, people who could design, manage, or leverage the new technology. They do very well.
The winners. And the other side?
A huge group of people left behind, permanently unemployed, stuck in lousy, temporary jobs, or finding their skills were just obsolete. He saw the middle class shrinking fast, economic insecurity soaring, basically a widening chasm between the tech-savvy haves and the displaced have-nots.
And he worried this wasn't just an economic problem, but could lead to social breakdown.
Absolutely. He connected this growing inequality directly to potential negative consequences. More crime, social unrest, conflict between the winners and losers. He used the term global outcasts. It was a pretty bleak outlook if things kept going that way.
Okay, wow. So given this pretty dark vision, did Rifkin offer any way out? Any solutions for the supposed post-work future?
He did, yes. He didn't think simply retraining everyone was realistic, so he proposed some big shifts. A major one was focusing on the third sector.
The third sector, what's that?
Basically the nonprofit world. Community groups, charities, voluntary organizations, social service agencies, the stuff that's not market-driven and not government.
Okay. And what role did he see for it?
He saw it as the place where people displaced from traditional jobs could find meaningful activity, rebuilding communities, caring for others, environmental work, arts, and culture. Things that contribute to society but aren't necessarily about profit. It was kind of a social and ethical response.
So shifting value from paid employment to community contribution, how would people live, though?
Good question. That led to his second big idea, the social wage.
Social wage. Like a basic income.
Sort of, but tied to participation. He suggested redirecting government funds, maybe savings from military spending, or a new tax like a VAT, a value-added tax on consumption to pay people who are actively working in recognized third sector organizations.
So income linked to community service, not traditional jobs. Replacing welfare, maybe?
That was the idea. Replace traditional welfare with something that fosters contribution. He also floated ideas like a shadow wage, basically tax breaks for volunteering to encourage it. He pointed to some historical basic income discussions and pilot projects, suggesting it wouldn't just make people lazy.
Interesting. Any other big solutions? What about just working less?
Yes, the reduced work week was the third pillar. He argued that as technology makes us more productive, we should share those gains by shortening working hours significantly.
Spread the remaining paid work around.
Exactly. Distribute the market jobs more fairly. reduce unemployment, and give everyone more leisure time. He noted that working hours had shrunk dramatically in the past and pointed to examples like a failed 30-hour-week bill in the U.S. during the Depression and some European companies experimenting with shorter hours.
So third sector, social wage, shorter work week.
Mhm.
Pretty radical reimagining of society. Did he have specific examples driving his fears?
He kept coming back to that cotton picker example. It was just such a stark illustration of how one technology could wipe out a whole category of labor and cause massive social disruption.
Right, showing tech could make skills totally irrelevant fast.
Yeah. He also pointed to corporate re-engineering, that 90s trend. He saw it as companies using new IT not just to automate, but to fundamentally restructure and eliminate layers of management and admin staff.
Connecting the management trend to the tech trend.
Exactly. And then just the visible stuff people were seeing. Robots in car plants, ATMs popping up, software doing tasks that secretaries or bookkeepers used to do. These were all signs for him that the end of work was already happening.
Okay, that lays out Rifkin's 1995 argument pretty clearly. A powerful, if scary, vision. Now, for the moment of truth,
Yeah.
how does it hold up against the last, nearly 30 years? Did the mass unemployment wave hit?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. The short answer is no, not in the way he predicted. While Rifkin was definitely onto something about the power of technology, and as we'll see, the growth of the nonprofit sector, that central prediction of mass, sustained, technology-driven unemployment just didn't fully materialize.
So the sky didn't fall?
The sky didn't fall in quite that way. The relationship between tech, jobs, productivity, wages, it turned out to be much more complex, much more nuanced than just tech destroys jobs.
Okay, let's break that down. What actually happened with the labor market? Unemployment rates, for instance.
Well, U.S. unemployment definitely didn't just steadily climb. It went down in the late 90s, boom, quite low actually. Then it went up after the dot-com bust and spiked really high, near 10% during the Great Recession around 2009.
Okay, so big swings with the economy.
Exactly. Cyclical. Then it came down again, very low pre-COVID, big spike with the pandemic, of course, but then it recovered again. The average for 2023 was like 3.7%. So definitely volatility, but not that relentless upward march Rifkin seemed to foresee due to tech.
Interesting. What about the number of jobs? Did total employment shrink?
Actually, no. Total non-farm employment in the U.S. grew quite a bit between 1995 and today. Millions more jobs exist now than then.
So jobs were created?
Yes. However, it's not quite that simple. The employment to population ratio, basically the share of working age people who actually have a job that peaked around 2000 and hasn't fully recovered. It was about 60.3% in 2023, lower than its peak near 64.5%.
So even if unemployment is low, fewer people overall are working. What does that mean?
It suggests other things are going on besides just technological unemployment. Demographics, like aging baby boomers retiring, maybe people dropping out of the labor force for various reasons, perhaps issues with job quality discouraging participation. It complicates the picture. And job tenure, how long people stay in a job, was relatively stable up to 2017, which counters the idea of everyone constantly churning through temporary gigs.
Okay. And the types of jobs?
Right.
Did the sectors shift as he predicted?
The big shift continued, yes. From goods-producing jobs like manufacturing to service-providing jobs, that trend was already happening, and it accelerated.
But Rifkin predicted losses in both, didn't he? Especially services.
He did. But in reality, the service sector has been the engine of net job growth overall. Now, within services, you definitely see the polarization Rifkin worried about. Growth in high-skill areas like professional services and healthcare, but also growth in lower-wage sectors like hospitality and retail.
So service jobs grew, but maybe not always good service jobs.
That's a big part of the story. Manufacturing employment, after steep declines before 95, actually stabilized somewhat in absolute numbers, though it continued to shrink as a share of total employment, and some industries remained under pressure. Agriculture continued its long-term decline as a share of jobs. And we did see growth in administrative and support services, including temp agencies, which fits Rifkin's point about precarious work to some extent.
What about working hours? Did we get that shorter work week he advocated for?
Not really. Average weekly hours for private non-farm workers have been remarkably stable, hovering around 34.5 hours. They actually ticked up slightly before 1995. No big move towards a 30-hour week or anything like that. Same for production workers, pretty stable around 33, 34 hours.
So if we put some numbers on this,
Yeah.
we have a couple of tables comparing 1995 and 2023.
Yeah, Table 1 shows that shift. Unemployment was 5.6% in 95, 3.7% in 2023, lower, despite the cycles. But the employment population ratio dropped from 62.9% to 60.3%. Average weekly hours basically flat, 34.5 then, 34.4 now.
And Table 2 shows the sector shift.
Right. Goods-producing jobs were about 21% of employment in 95, down to roughly 14% in 2023. Service-providing jobs went from 79% up to about 86%, a very clear shift.
So the takeaway is, mass unemployment didn't happen. The labor market adapted, maybe in ways Rifkin didn't fully anticipate.
It seems so. There appear to be adaptive mechanisms, job creation dynamics that offset the displacement effects, at least at the aggregate level.
Okay, but Rifkin's argument linked job losses to huge productivity gains from technology. What happened with productivity? Did it boom?
That's another really complex piece. We did see a productivity surge in the late 90s, early 2000s. That coincided with widespread adoption of computers and the internet. It looked like Rifkin might be right then. But then, kind of puzzlingly, productivity growth slowed down quite significantly from about 2005 right up until the pandemic. Even though technology kept advancing, smartphones, cloud computing, AI starting, the overall productivity growth was well below historical averages for a long stretch.
The productivity paradox or something.
Yeah.
We have all this tech, but we're not getting proportionally more efficient.
Exactly. There was an initial paradox, then the speed up, but then this prolonged slowdown. It's been a huge puzzle for economists. There have been some recent upticks, but that sustained exponential growth Rifkin's thesis seemed to rely on, it just didn't consistently show up in the national stats. Table 3 summarizes this: a speed-up period, then a long slowdown, and then the pandemic-era volatility.
So if productivity growth wasn't always stellar, maybe the impact of automation itself was more measured than Rifkin feared.
That seems plausible. Yes, robot use has increased, especially in manufacturing, though the U.S. actually lagged some other countries initially. And studies do find that automation, particularly robots, displaced some workers, especially those doing routine manual tasks in specific industries or regions.
But it wasn't a total wipeout.
No, because there are these other forces at work. Automation can lower costs, which can increase demand for products, leading to hiring elsewhere. It creates completely new tasks and jobs needed to design, build, manage, and work alongside the new technologies.
Like programmers, data analysts.
Right. And there are spillover effects. Maybe lower prices for consumers mean they spend money elsewhere, creating jobs in other sectors. Think about the ATM example again.
Right. You said teller jobs actually increased for a while.
For a time, yes. Because banks could open more branches more cheaply and tellers shifted to more sales and customer service roles. Now, eventually that trend reversed, but it shows it's not always a simple substitution. Telephone operator automation caused big losses there, but overall clerical and service jobs grew elsewhere for a long time.
So it's disruption and transition, not just elimination.
Exactly. Now, the caveat is that current AI might be different, potentially hitting higher-skilled cognitive tasks harder. Early estimates suggest many jobs have tasks exposed to AI, but exposure includes augmentation, helping workers, not just replacement. It's really hard to isolate the net effect of technology alone.
And scholars have pushed back on Rifkin's view.
Yes, many criticize that technological determinism we mentioned. They argue he overlooked how capitalism works, how labor markets adjust, the role of policy, worker power, and so on. The whole idea of creative destruction, where old jobs die but new ones are born, seems more accurate than just destruction. Some research even found that computer adoption in the late 20th century was linked to increased employment overall, not decreased.
So labor markets adapt, though it can be painful for those disrupted. The lack of mass unemployment suggests these adaptive forces were stronger than Rifkin maybe gave them credit for.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The adaptation process isn't smooth or painless, but the system seems to have found ways to generate new work, even amidst massive technological change.
Okay, so mass unemployment didn't happen. But you mentioned Rifkin's concerns about inequality in the middle class. How did those predictions fare? Because that feels like a big part of the story of the last few decades.
Absolutely. And this is where Rifkin's warnings feel much more resonant with reality. While the quantity of work didn't vanish, the quality and distribution of work and wages is a different story.
What happened with wages for the average worker?
For long stretches, real wage growth for typical workers was pretty stagnant or very slow. It often failed to keep pace with productivity gains or overall economic growth.
So the economy grew, but the average paycheck didn't necessarily reflect that.
Precisely. We have Table 4 showing real, median, usual weekly earnings. If you adjust for inflation, there was modest growth between 1995 and the late 2010s, with some recent increases, but it definitely didn't mirror the growth in GDP per capita or the wage growth seen at the very top. There were even periods like 1995 itself, with year-over-year declines in real average earnings. This gap between productivity and median compensation is really well documented.
And the polarization he predicted. The split between elites and the rest.
The evidence largely supports increased economic polarization, yes. Maybe not exactly the tiny elite versus vast unemployed masses he depicted, but certainly a squeeze on the middle.
The hollowing out of the middle class.
Exactly. We've seen a relative decline in middle-skill, middle-wage jobs, think traditional manufacturing or administrative roles, compared to growth at both the high-skill, high-wage and managers, professionals, and the low-skill, low-wage and some service jobs.
What drove that?
Economists point to a combination of factors, including automation hitting those routine middle-skill tasks particularly hard, and globalization shifting some production overseas. Wage growth has been significantly stronger for those at the top, say the 90th percentile, than for those in the middle or at the bottom.
So inequality definitely increased.
Yes, and automation's impacts haven't been evenly distributed across demographics either. Some studies show Black and Hispanic workers were often overrepresented in the occupations most susceptible to automation. So while Rifkin's specific image of the polarization might have been off, his core concern about rising inequality and the pressure on middle-class livelihoods has been absolutely central to the economic story of the last 30 years. Some very recent work even suggests a new polarization phase might be emerging, with declines in low and middle-paid jobs and growth concentrated in high-paid STEM roles.
So on inequality and the changing nature of work, Rifkin was much closer to the mark, even if the mechanism wasn't purely mass unemployment.
I think that's right. The distribution of economic rewards changed dramatically.
Okay, let's revisit his main proposed solution, the third sector. Did the nonprofit world grow as he predicted?
It absolutely did. On this point, Rifkin's foresight looks pretty sharp.
You have data on that.
Yeah, drawing from sources like the National Center for Charitable Statistics. The number of registered nonprofits, especially public charities, 501c3s, grew significantly. For instance, between 2000 and 2010 alone, the number increased by about 24%.
And their economic footprint
Also grew substantially. Total revenues and assets of these nonprofits grew much faster than GDP, even after adjusting for inflation, like over 40% growth in that decade. Government funding remained a big slice of their revenue, about a third. By 2010, estimates put the nonprofit sector's contribution to U.S. GDP at around 5.5%, and related social enterprises were growing too.
And what about jobs in the third sector?
It became a major employer, and a surprisingly resilient one. It was often identified as the fastest-growing employment sector in many advanced economies, employing over 10% of the workforce in places like the US, UK, Canada by the early 2010s. It even added jobs during the Great Recession when other sectors were shedding them. Table 5 shows some of these growth metrics from around 2000 to 2010, more organizations, much higher revenues and assets, growing share of GDP and employment.
Wow, so the sector he highlighted really did boom.
It did. Rifkin himself wrote later with increasing optimism about this social commons. It clearly plays a vital role in delivering services, building communities, fostering civic life.
But did it become the primary safety net for technologically displaced workers, funded by a social wage like he envisioned?
That's the crucial distinction. While the sector grew, it wasn't necessarily for the exact reasons or with the funding mechanism Rifkin proposed. Its growth came from many things: government outsourcing, philanthropic trends, responses to social needs. The large-scale social wage policy didn't happen.
So it grew, but not necessarily as the answer to technological unemployment in the way he framed it.
Right. It's a vital sector, a major employer, but whether it has the capacity or funding structure currently to absorb millions of people displaced by, say, AI, without those radical policy shifts Rifkin talked about, that's a big question mark. It relies heavily on existing funding streams, grants, donations.
Okay, so summing up this deep dive, Rifkin's 1995 prediction of mass technological unemployment didn't really come to pass in the aggregate. Labor markets adapted, jobs were created, productivity growth was uneven.
Correct. The simple deterministic link wasn't there.
But his concerns about job quality, wage stagnation for many, rising inequality, the polarization of the labor market, those themes strongly resonated with the economic reality of the last 3 decades.
Very much so. The distribution of work and rewards changed significantly, even if the total amount didn't vanish.
And his prediction about the growth and importance of the third sector, the nonprofit world, was also largely accurate, even if its role didn't quite match his proposed solution.
Exactly. He identified key trends, even if his central forecast was off.
Which makes his work still incredibly relevant today, right? As we face another wave of potentially transformative technology with advanced AI.
Absolutely. The fundamental questions he raised, how does technology reshape work? Who benefits? Who gets left behind? What is the role of work in a good society? These are perhaps more urgent now than they were in 1995.
Which brings us to that final thought for you, the listener, thinking about everything we've discussed. Is this time really different? Is AI going to trigger the kind of mass displacement Rifkin foresaw, even if earlier tech didn't?
Or even if it doesn't lead to mass unemployment, how do we grapple with its potential impact on job quality, wage inequality, and the very meaning of work? What kinds of policies, maybe updated versions of Rifkin's ideas, maybe something totally new do we need to navigate this?
Rifkin ended his book talking about a choice facing humanity between societal decay stemming from these trends or a great social transformation towards something new. That choice, it really feels like it's still right in front of us as technology keeps accelerating. Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about.
Thanks for diving deep with us.